All right, good morning and good evening to everyone who's joining this conversation on opportunities for sustainable power developments in the Mekong. My name is Courtney Weatherby. I'm the Deputy Director with the Southeast Asia Program, and we're gonna just hold tight for a couple minutes. We're getting people coming in from the waiting room, and we wanna give everyone's audio and video a chance to connect before we get started. So please hang on and we'll get started momentarily. So for those who've just joined us, welcome, good morning and good evening, depending on if you're in the United States or Southeast Asia. We're just giving everyone a chance to come in from the waiting room, and then we're going to get started momentarily. So I'd say hang tight for just a minute, and then I'll turn things over to Pinita to get us started. It looks like our trickle of attendees coming in has slowed slightly. So I'll go ahead and just take this opportunity to very briefly give some logistical remarks before we get into the meat of the panel. So we're delighted to have everyone joining today. We do hope that this will be a somewhat interactive conversation with the audience. So as we go through our paper presentations and as we go through our discussion comments with our panelists, please feel free to at any point drop any comments or questions into the Q&A channel. Our team will be watching those, and when we get to the end of the event, then Pinita and I will be pulling questions to discuss as a group. So please do feel free to drop comments in there at any point during the conversation today. We always like to see those, and it's a great way for us to sort of follow up and see where there are opportunities for us to expand further on the papers that we've written and that we're sharing. So with that noted, Pinita, I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to you for officially kicking us off.
Thank you, Courtney. Good morning, everyone from Mekong regions, and good evening for those who's in different time zones across on the other side of the world. My name is Pinita Lilapanang Kampeng Thong. I'm the program manager at Sustainable Infrastructure Partnership implemented by PAC Thailand. It's my pleasure and our team pleasure today to be able to co-host this event with the Stimson Center. So before we go further into the agenda, let me briefly run through what we have today. So we have the opening remarks by Tom Schmidt and Priscilla Van. And then we will jump into the two presentations by the Stimson Center and Mekong University team. Then we will have panelists to discuss on how we link that two papers and also other relevant studies with the Mekong regions. And then you all will have a chance to discuss and ask questions with the panelists and also open the floor for open discussion. So let's start with the opening remarks. May I invite Thomas Schmidt, the Director of Regional Environment at Science, Technology and Health Office, U.S. Embassy, Bangkok.
Thanks, Pinita. And good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone joining us from around the world. Today, we'll be discussing the prospects of how the Mekong region can adapt to the clean energy transition while meeting the rapid rise of electricity demand without compromising environmental, social, and economic needs, all while coping with the impacts of climate change and the COVID-19 pandemic. The Asian Development Bank projects that energy demand in Asia will double between now and 2030. To meet these needs, we'll have to identify new opportunities to increase our production potential, improve distribution, and capitalize on the synergies among water, food, energy, and the environment. Overcoming these challenges requires a longer-term, multi-sector perspective that can lead to new opportunities for growth and reduction of risks and vulnerabilities. The United States is committed to working with Mekong countries to realize a secure, open, and prosperous Mekong region. Through the Mekong-US partnership, the United States is partnering with Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, Thailand, and Vietnam on solutions to emerging challenges, including transboundary resource management and regional energy needs. The the Mekong region has an opportunity to scale up the use of renewable energy dramatically. The region's abundant solar and wind potential, the smart use of hydropower, and growing interest in distributed generation can accelerate the region's power sector decarbonization. Enhanced cross-border electricity trade can also enable the increased use of renewable energy, offering larger balancing areas to help manage the impact of wind and solar viability. We've seen strong private sector interest in clean energy investment opportunities and understand the inherent challenges associated with the rapid upscaling of the region's electricity grid. That's why the US Department of State's Energy Resources Bureau is helping Thailand prepare for increased market competition and the use of renewable energy through technical training, advisory support, and regulatory capacity building. With the US Department of State supporting the Japan-US Mekong Power Partnership, we've trained officials on tools to enhance reliability, power exchanges, peer-to-peer trading, and establish an energy trading company. Thailand is a critical partner, and we look forward to deepening our collaboration. Through these programs and the US Mekong Partnership, the Department of State continues to work together with Mekong nations to ensure the region can meet rapidly rising electricity demands and adapt to the clean energy transition. Leading this work is the critical research from academia, nonprofit, and think tank stakeholders. Today's discussion will center around two complementary studies, which the Mekong-US Partnership, the Sustainable Infrastructure Partnership funded. First, the Stimson Center's report, Lower Mekong Power Developments, Drought Renewable Disruptions, and Electricity Trade. And second, the Mekong University and University of North Carolina report, Economic and Environmental Assessment of Lower Mekong Countries' Power Development Plans. In the Stimson Center report on Lower Mekong Power Developments, lead author Courtney Weatherby outlines the challenges and opportunities for the Mekong region's transition to clean energy as electricity demand grows and regional electricity trade rises. In the report, Courtney also outlines technological advances in the energy sector, including solar power and battery storage, and offers recommendations on energy planning and decision-making. And in the report, Economic and Environmental Assessment of Lower Mekong Country Power Development Plans, authors David Wood and Apasan Intralawan of Mekong University outline the energy and environmental impacts of the Mekong country's proposal to build new coal power plants. In the report, Apasan and David propose an alternative plan based on no new coal power plants or new Mekong mainstream hydropower projects. They also review recent changes to regional forecasts of electricity supply and demand. Thanks again for joining us as we learn more from Courtney, David, Apasan, and all the other Mekong power sector experts we have gathered here today to discuss opportunities for sustainable development in the Mekong. I wish you the best in today's discussions.
Thank you so much, Tom. Next, may I invite Chrissy Owen, PAC Thailand's Country Director.
Thanks, Panita, and thank you, Tom, for the opening remarks. Just a few words for me. First of all, hello, welcome. I wish I could see your all faces, but I can tell from the participant list that there's a lot of familiar people here with us today, and it's great that you've joined, and it's great that this community continues to go strong, despite our inability to actually be in a room together. So I just want to say first, on behalf of PACT and the Sustainable Infrastructure Partnership, or SIP, I am very pleased to be able to welcome you here today, and I'm grateful that you're taking the time to join us for this important conversation. I do want to start by acknowledging and giving a special thanks to our co-host, the Stimson Center, as well as Mekong University and panelists from Stanford University, Chulalongkorn University, Hanoi University of Science and Technology, as well as the National Renewable Energy Lab, who have contributed their time and energy to share their thoughts with us here today. So thank you very much. For those who don't know, for the past 15 years, PACT has implemented programs in the Mekong region, which deliver results for both a healthy environment and resilient communities. The SIP program, funded by the US Department of State under the Mekong-US Partnership, delivers support to the governments of the Lower Mekong, specifically in two core areas. First is enhancing capacity in managing the water energy food nexus. And second is supporting open water data sharing for transparent transboundary water management and policymaking. This support that we deliver, we hope will contribute to a sustainable development and reduce water-related disaster in the Mekong region. And so one of the ways that SIP leverages the expertise and resources among development partners like those here with us today and you in the audience is through policy dialogues, such as we're doing today. The objective is to present new research and practical findings to you, the practitioners, to support sustainable development policy recommendations to regional governments. Today, we are proud to provide a platform for research done by the Stimson Center and Mayphalong University. We have worked closely with these two organizations over the past few months, probably going on a little longer than that now, to review and analyze alternatives to energy development policies and practices, which are needed to shift the needle for sustainable and clean energy transition here in the region. And work that you'll hear about in more detail momentarily, and which Tom thankfully provided a bit of a synopsis for to set the stage. So just a few thoughts before I close here. One of the jobs through SIP is to facilitate more events like this one that build capacity, provide a platform for cooperation and exchange, and ultimately build a better world for ourselves and future generations. We plan to continue to organize similar events to the one today, and we want your suggestions on what would be most useful for you to learn about more and to have a platform like this to discuss and share. So please feel free to drop your suggestions through the SIP Facebook page at Mekong SIP or the website at mekongsip.org or the MWDI data sharing platform at mekongwater.org. And if you don't have those tabbed and saved on your website, please do so now. But in the meantime, if you don't and you forget, you can always contact Panita and our great team at SIP directly to share your thoughts, ideas, and feedback. It's always welcome. So I'm going to stop there because I'm definitely not the star of this show, and I'm sure you all want to get on with the work at hand. So I'll just leave you with thanking you again for joining us today, and I do wish you all a very productive and interesting session. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here.
Thank you so much, Chrissy. I think it's time for us to just deep dive into this two papers that we've been talking about. So let's start with the first presenter, Courtney Weatherby from the Stimson Center. You know, she's the Deputy Director of Southeast Asia Program, and she's been a research analyst with Southeast Asia on the energy, water, and sustainability programs. Her research focuses on the sustainable infrastructure and energy development challenges in Southeast Asia, especially in the Indo-Pacific and the greater Mekong sub-region. So today she will present one of her research among many that you have heard. Please, Courtney, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Peanut. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So hopefully it'll take just a second for that to connect to everyone. To running through a PowerPoint. So as Peanut said, I'm here today to sort of share an overview of this recent study that PACT and the Mekong US Partnership supported on lower Mekong power developments, drought, renewable disruptions, and electricity trade. And the goal of this report is really to provide policymakers with sort of situational awareness on technological advances and energy system shocks and developments, and provide some recommendations on how to make strategic long-term decisions on energy infrastructure and market opportunities following the COVID-19 pandemic. So I think it's useful to start, and I won't spend too much on this because I think there's been a lot of conversation already about sort of the needs in Southeast Asia, but it's important to sort of start with the anticipated energy demand growth that's facing Southeast Asia and specifically facing countries in the Mekong region. So we know that the International Energy Agency has projected Southeast Asia will see about a 60% energy demand growth between 2019 and 2040. This is due to, many factors. I think we're all sort of familiar with urbanization, industrialization, population growth, but it really requires an immense amount of new power generation capacity to come onto the grid for Southeast Asia. So just to put that into perspective, the amount of energy that's needed is approximately the same installed capacity as Japan. So it's like adding an entire Japan to the grid of the Mekong countries. Most of the countries face sort of a national rapidly rising electricity demand. Obviously, there is some differentiation between individual countries. So I think it's worth noting that among the Mekong countries, 4 out of the 5 have in recent years regularly hit annual demand growth of over 10%. So, that's 10% of the electricity system that needs to be added every year in order to keep up with demand. While those projected electricity demand rates are dropping somewhat for most of the countries in the region, they're still remaining higher than the global average. And this really means that just for the 5 Mekong countries, approximately 170,000 megawatts of new power generation is necessary, according to the most recent national power demand plans. Within that context, I think it's important to sort of note that most of that is coming from Thailand and coming from Vietnam, which have by far the largest power systems in the region. So of that 170,000 megawatts that's projected for the Mekong countries, 55,000 megawatts of that is to support demand in Thailand. And a significant portion of that is actually replacements for existing capacity. So Thailand has sort of the most developed energy system in the Mekong region, and a lot of the power plants are getting old and they need to be retired and replaced with new power plants of some sort. And so a lot of that capacity is going to sort of be replacing those older plants. When we look at the map of the region, however, you'll see that most of these countries, they certainly are developing domestic electricity supply, but the electricity trade plays a key role in regional power developments. And this is particularly true for Thailand. So when we look at Thailand's role in the region, it really plays sort of two separate but linked factors that influence broader market trends. So, a large portion of the projected needs are going to be built to meet Thailand's electricity demand. Much of that will be inside of Thailand's national borders, but some of it will actually be coming from imports. So Thailand has a long history of electricity trade with its neighbors, particularly with Laos, and has a stated policy goal of becoming an electricity trading hub for the region. Now, this fits within the ASEAN Power Grid vision of multilateral electricity trade, and it also makes some sense given Thailand's sort of geographic location, where it's sort of in the heart. It's connected to Laos, it's connected to Cambodia, it's connected to Myanmar, and then to Malaysia, and through Malaysia to Singapore. So when you look at the region, there's sort of a rationale for Thailand playing an electricity trading hub role. This also is complemented in terms of regional influence by Thai companies' heavy involvement in the power sector of other countries. So this is particularly true for Laos, where we see significant and rapid hydropower development over the last decade and projected for coming decades, where Thai companies are involved in about 60% of the existing power generation projects in Laos that are inside of the Mekong Infrastructure Tracker, which has project level data and allows for analysis on sort of the companies involved and the countries involved. We can see a similar influence in sort of the planned and under construction projects where Thailand is involved in, or Thai companies are involved in an additional 40% of everything that's being built in Laos's energy sector right now, as well as many planned projects in Myanmar and Vietnam. So you can see every dot on the map on this slide is a project that has at least one Thai company involved in either constructing it, financing it, or acting as the overall project sponsor or developer. So within that context, Thailand is both an investor in power development around the region, as well as a purchaser of electricity around the region. It has existing MOUs, or memorandums of understanding, for electricity trade with its neighbors. Obviously, Laos, as I mentioned, it has a long history of trade with Laos dating back to 1971, when the first large-scale hydropower project, the Nam Neum 1, came online in Laos. Since then, Thailand has rapidly, over time, expanded the amount of electricity that purchases, and it has an MOU from 2016 to import a total of 9,000 megawatts of capacity by the mid-2030s. This was actually amended earlier this year to add an additional 1,200 megawatts from existing hydropower projects. So Thailand overall has plans to potentially import from up to 10,200 megawatts of projects inside Laos. It also has an MOU to export some electricity to Malaysia and Singapore. The amount of that is relatively limited. Right now it's capped at 300 megawatts through the early 2020s, but it's kind of the first foray for all of Southeast Asia into multilateral electricity trade. So Thailand is sort of at the forefront here of looking at regional electricity trade with some goal, as Tom stated in his opening remarks, of sort of expanding connections in order to support renewable energy transition and clean energy sources. However, I think it's important to recognize that when you talk about clean energy in ASEAN, most countries count hydropower as a clean energy source. And as those who follow developments in the Mekong know, while hydropower might be, depending on the project, more carbon friendly than traditional fossil fuels, that it has many controversial social and environmental impacts. And so as we look at Thailand's role as an electricity trade hub, we do want to think about sort of those future electricity trades and those future developments within the context of the clean energy transition, some of the challenges and opportunities within. When we're looking at that electricity trading hub concept, I do think it's important to consider the scale of electricity trade. So as I mentioned before, Thailand has 300 megawatts of exports to Malaysia and Singapore right now. It has commented, policymakers from Thailand and its neighbors have commented on exploring an additional 500 megawatts of electricity trade between Thailand and Myanmar and Cambodia. But altogether, that only comes to 800 megawatts. And when we look at the amount of electricity that Thailand is looking to purchase from Laos of over 10,000 megawatts, and when you consider that there's significant excess inside Thailand's electricity system right now, that's a huge amount of power that doesn't necessarily have an easy opportunity to be absorbed. So when you look at the potential markets for Thailand's electricity trade, there really are 4 countries that matter: Cambodia, Myanmar, and Malaysia, all of which share direct borders with Thailand, and then Singapore, which has multilateral electricity trade through Thailand. And the ability of those 4 countries to import both politically and economically, and then physically in terms of transmission infrastructure, the ability of those 4 countries to actually absorb maybe over 10,000 megawatts of excess power or power that's being traded through Thailand from Laos is actually somewhat questionable. When you look at Cambodia, for instance, they already have an agreement to directly purchase over 2,000 megawatts of coal projects from Laos. When you look at Myanmar, Myanmar has some trade that they're exploring with Laos as well in border areas, but they lack a national transmission grid to import electricity effectively to the demand center. So there's a lot of physical infrastructure that would need to be built out to export electricity to Myanmar in the near term. And Myanmar has also previously explored electricity trade opportunities with Yunnan province in China, which has historically had significant excess hydroelectricity available. And the size of the electricity markets in both Cambodia and Myanmar is relatively limited. Cambodia's installed capacity is less than 3,000 megawatts. So when you compare that against, for instance, the 10,000 megawatts of potential excess that's available from Thailand's domestic system, and then the additional electricity trade with Laos that they're pursuing, it's really unclear if most of that power will have a clear market in Cambodia or Myanmar. Malaysia and Singapore are longer term opportunities. But this is where we have to start thinking about sort of the economics of electricity trade and the challenges of managing electricity trade within the renewable energy transition. So Malaysia obviously has significant land and significant renewable opportunities on its own. Singapore actually is probably the most likely market here because they don't have the land to develop their own additional renewable or other power generation capacity, and they are likely to be importing significant amounts of that. But the question of where will they import that from is one that's worth exploring, because Malaysia has expressed interest in developing power domestically to export to Singapore. And there's also conversation about electricity trade with Indonesia or even Australia to import renewable energy. So when we're looking at electricity trade, we have to think within some of these broader market shifts that we're seeing and technological disruptions that are changing the way that the energy system works. I think there's no other trend that is more important to the region than the price drop of renewable energy technologies. And I'm not going to spend too much time talking about why the prices drop, because I think that a lot of us have talked about that before. But many of us, you can track that over the last decade plus, since 2009, for instance, that prices of solar have dropped more than 90%. Globally, wind has dropped approximately 65%, and it's now sort of regularly accepted that the cost of electricity from solar is now only about 3 US cents per kilowatt hour to 4.4 US cents per kilowatt hour. Well, it took some time for these low prices to reach the Mekong region. As you can see to the left, looking at power purchase agreements for individual projects around the Mekong region, those prices have dropped. Really looking to 2018 onwards, we've seen the tariff agreements for prices drop within that realm And this really puts the new solar and wind projects on somewhat competitive economic footing with more traditional alternatives. New hydropower projects, for instance, are regularly coming online and selling power from 6 to 7 cents per kilowatt hour. So clearly there's an opportunity here economically to invest in renewable alternatives. And countries in the region have responded, particularly in the last 2 to 3 years. So we went from seeing in 2017 only Thailand having any significant grid connected solar capacity to an explosion of solar around the region. Vietnam in particular has set some records by surpassing Thailand, going from almost no solar in 2017 to more than 16,000 megawatts of solar as of 2021. And much of that, about 9,500 megawatts of which are actually rooftop solar projects. While Cambodia hasn't seen such an expansion in terms of installed capacity, it has added a couple hundred megawatts of solar capacity and now has a national target of bringing solar to 20% of the total energy supply by the mid-2020s. Laos has a couple large-scale floating solar projects under development, and Thailand has a long-term target of over 12,000 megawatts and has just indicated that there may be a doubling of the floating solar target. So we are seeing kind of this rapid adoption of alternative renewable energies, energy technologies in the energy system now that the economics of it really make sense. And this provides some opportunity for strategic investment in the region, particularly as an alternative to controversial hydropower projects with significant environmental impacts or carbon-heavy emission projects like coal. There are a few challenges that have emerged with this rapid rollout of solar, in particular in Vietnam. And I think, if you've been following the news, you can see that there's some indications that certain projects have been curtailed in terms of electricity output because of challenges with grid connectivity or challenges of grid integration. So another technology that I think it's important to sort of look at in terms of regional planning and in terms of sort of potential disruption is energy storage technology. There's really two types that I think are worth considering, which policymakers are already exploring right now in the region, which could support the integration of further amounts of renewables into the energy system. The first of these is pumped hydropower storage. It is a familiar technology, works very similar to sort of traditional hydropower, except that like the photo you see here of the Lam Tak Hong pumped hydropower plant in Thailand, it uses excess electricity during times of day where the peak demand has not been hit to pump water into an upper reservoir where it can be stored and then released and used in much the same way as a traditional hydropower project would by releasing water through turbines at times of day when the peak demand spikes. So Thailand has 3 existing pumped hydropower projects. Vietnam is considering additional projects, and there's a lot of discussion sort of globally about the opportunity that this provides if strategically invested in to support the wider integration of variable renewable energy like solar and wind, which are not dispatchable without some sort of backup supply for the grid. The second opportunity, which policymakers in Southeast Asia and the Mekong countries in particular are really just starting to sort of move on, is battery storage technology. So there are a lot of different types of battery storage. Lithium-ion batteries tend to be the most common and the most popular, in part because they're also used for electric vehicles. But battery storage has for many years been used as a backup for household or mini grid solar deployment systems. And we're now starting to see pilot projects in the region, many supported by the Asian Development Bank, to deploy larger amounts of battery technology as kind of a backup, either on site as a hybrid with an existing solar or wind project, or just as a battery, much like the Tesla Reserve in Australia or in the United States has been used to sort of utilize as a storage for grid connected electricity, where it just sucks up renewable energy times of day where it's overproducing and then releases that energy back into the grid at a later date, like for instance, when everyone in a city turns on their air conditioning on a particularly hot day, even though it's not peak production for solar or wind. Finally, I think moving beyond some of these technological shifts, which are broadly impacting the market, it's useful to talk briefly about 2 types of shocks that we see in the Mekong region which are impacting sort of the energy sector and which intersect with sort of those multi-sector planning approaches that were referenced in the introductory remarks. So the first of these is drought. And you'll see that the chart on this slide shows a timeline of major droughts and impacts in the Mekong River Basin since the 1970s. And if you look at the specific dates, you'll see that these droughts are becoming more common. So as many of us know, the Mekong River plays a key defining role for the region as sort of a geographic signifier, but it also underpins absolutely vital food security for the region through supporting fisheries production, particularly in the Tonle Sap Lake and sort of the pulse of fish that flows back into the system from that lake, depending on the wet and dry season differences. It supports agricultural production, bringing sediment downstream to riverbanks, floodplains in the Mekong Delta. It provides water security for folks throughout the region, and obviously it provides electricity production. Any sort of interruption, such as a major drought, will impact all of those potential elements. I think the 2019-2020 drought that we've recently experienced in the Mekong region really revealed major vulnerabilities for the region as a whole, but in particular for countries like Cambodia that are very reliant on hydropower as a part of their electricity supply. So the major drought that led to really record-setting low rainfall, shifting in the timing of rains in 2019 and 2020, actually led to some significant drops in hydropower electric productivity because of the low water in reservoirs. So climate change is the key cause of the drought, but drought both impacts and is worsened by the impacts of hydropower when you think about water management for the region, because most of the hydropower dams, particularly the large storage dams upstream in China, are refilling the reservoirs during the wet season. So as they close the gates and begin to hold water back to capture it for use during the dry season, this reduces the flow downstream, which has clear and direct impacts on fisheries production and agricultural productivity and sustainability for communities downstream. So, we face kind of this multi-sector challenge of many impacts across different sectors and the need to sort of coordinate hydropower and other dams in the future to ensure that they avoid those deep impacts that we've seen in recent years, and also to consider sort of the long-term resilience and reliability of hydropower in a region where drought is becoming more severe and more common. The second shock that I just want to briefly touch on is COVID-19. So I think all of us are intimately familiar with the challenges that COVID-19 poses for daily life. It's had major impacts on key industries around the region: exports, manufacturing, tourism. That also has a direct impact on electricity use. The lockdowns that we've all seen over the last couple of years have impacted many commercial and industrial ventures. They've closed people in at home. It's changed the way that electricity use is consumed in many of the countries globally. And in Southeast Asia, we saw that there was a 4% contraction of the economy and sort of a corresponding 3% drop in electricity demand last year. This is certainly uneven. Certain countries were hit harder than others. Cambodia, for instance, saw an electricity demand drop of 20% in 2020, whereas Thailand only saw a 3% year-on-year decline in electricity demand, and Vietnam actually still saw some growth, although at a much slower pace than usual. But the opportunity that this provides is significant, because when you compare those low rates of growth in 2020, or even contractions in 2020 in many countries, to the usual 10% or more annual demands that you've seen, this essentially provides some breathing space for planners who are looking to sort of fill immediate gaps by bringing new electricity online, because we now see sort of an excess of electricity that will take some time to soak up, even as the economy begins to recover. And given the renewable energy transition and these other shocks, this sort of provides an opportunity for policymakers to take a breath and perhaps rethink some of the strategies and some of the targets that they have. So I'm going to essentially stop there with a few sort of key takeaways from the analysis that I just shared with you on regional energy markets. And I want to make sure that we have an opportunity to sort of turn into a conversation about many of the projections, which David and Apisam will share. But I'm happy to discuss some of these opportunities for reaffirming ambitions for the energy transition as a part of COVID recovery. I'm happy to talk through some of the specific things that Thailand could do as it moves towards becoming an electricity trading hub to meeting long-term carbon neutrality targets, to strategically plan electricity trade and investment in ways that would support long-term climate and environment goals. And I think there's also opportunities to sort of talk further about some of these specific technologies. But I'm going to stop there because I've talked for a long time already, and I want to turn things over to Afisam and David to talk about some of their broader analysis on needs for the region.
Thank you, Courtney. I guess without further ado, I think we move to the next presenter from Mekong University. Absom Intralawan and David Wood, who's been working researching on this water food energy nexus trade-offs in the Mekong Basin for a long time. And also, okay, you ready? Yes, please, the floor is yours.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, thank you, Pinida, and thank you, Courtney, for an overview of the Regional Power Development Plan. Our team assigned to quantify the economic and environmental impacts of business as usual plan, and also we proposed the alternative plan. Our team composed of David Wood, Noah Kidner, and myself from Mekong University. Oops. All right, the objective is to review the each country national development power development plan and look at the supply demand balance, and also identify and access economic and environmental impacts, and provide some alternatives and update the change that recently happened. This report finished about almost a year ago, so there is lots of update. So Courtney already talked about the situation in the Mekong countries, Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, and Vietnam. So here is some statistics about different stage of power development. So you can see that Thailand has greatest consumption per capita, but Vietnam already surpassed in terms of the generation capacity, and Laos and Cambodia are still struggling with the electricity access. Okay, but these countries are projected demand growth about 8% per annum in the next 10 years. So here is we review the generation capacity as of 2019. So the Mekong countries total generation capacity is about 110 gigawatt, and coal and gas accounted for about 56%. All right, so to meet the increasing demand, so this is a supply side. Each country plan to add altogether about 110 gigawatt, you know. So but if you look at the future plan proposed by each government, you can see that coal and gas is still a dominant source of energy. So in 2030, the Lower Mekong countries plan to have the 220 gigawatt generation capacity, and coal and gas is accounting for about 52%. You know, it's reduced from 56 to 52, but we think that the number is still high. So this is the proposal for alternative plan. We think that from the demand side, we have to get a realistic demand forecast, because like for example, Thailand, we overestimated always, you know, the demand forecast. So in terms of energy conservation, we have to do more on this, and we should introduce the pricing mechanism for demand management to distribute the peak demand to some time that we don't need. In terms of the supply side, we propose no more coal power, no more mainstream dam, no nuclear, and substitute coal with the renewable energy, especially solar. And to make the renewable possible, we also need to improve the supply reliability by optimizing use of the low cost energy, reduce transmission loss, and improve the grid and energy storage system. So we roughly calculate the benefit and cost, and we found that our alternative plant could save altogether about 250 billion in terms of net present values. And the picture, the table illustrate some of the numbers. For example, we can save the capital investment by 70 billions and reduce generation costs about 90 billions, reduce carbon emissions, no more Mekong hydro project that also save about 15 billions. And what is very important here is about to save 20,000 lives from premature death from air pollution. So this is my last slide. So the alternative plan is much cheaper and more sustainable. So economic and environmental feasible, and reduce the capital investment, 120 billion over the next 10 years, reduce the generation cost by 23 billion, and save transmission loss, save carbon emission and health related costs, and also less impact from hydropower development in the Mekong. Okay, so I will pass on to David. He will present the update. Okay, David.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Abisom, and good morning and good evening to everybody. The photo's not changed, but the voice has changed. I'm going to review some recently announced changes to power development plans, and I'm going to start off with the supply side and Cambodia. Next. Right. So for Cambodia, the good news is the moratorium on mainstream hydropower. The solar plan is a bit disappointing. They had a pilot project and it got a tender price of only $4 per kilowatt hour, but their future solar plans are not very ambitious. Bad news is on coal. Cambodia is currently building 3 coal power plants, and there are 2 more in the pipeline. And they've also signed a PPA to import electricity from Laos based on coal. So this means that by 2030, more than 50% of Cambodia's electricity will be generated from coal. Next. Laos, they just issued a new power development plan, which still focuses on Mekong mainstream hydropower. They assume that Luang Prabang will start up in 2027. And the photo on the right was taken 2 months ago at Luang Prabang, showing construction works there. They also plan 3 more projects by 2030, 2 more mainstream projects. They're also building coal. They're going to expand the Hong Sa coal plant, which provides electricity to Thailand, and they plan to export to Vietnam and Cambodia, also based on coal. Next. Thailand. The photo is the floating solar project at Serinton Dam, recently completed, and it's expected to start commercial operations this month. And it's the first of many floating solar projects planned in Thailand. As Courtney mentioned, Thailand also plans to import more electricity from Laos based on hydropower and coal. But good news on coal, that the planned coal power stations at Krabi and Taper have been delayed, and maybe they won't go ahead at all. Quick note on the International Energy Agency study. It was on flexibility of Thailand's supply, and they recommended that EGAT renegotiate their long-term PPAs. I think, easier said than done. And they also said, recommended to reduce the reserve margin, currently over 40% to about 15%. So, 2 years ago, Vietnam was the laggard in renewables in the region. And now they're the leader. And this all changed in early 2020 when they introduced the feed-in tariff for rooftop solar. I think the feed-in tariff was about $8 per kilowatt hour. And that resulted in an amazing 9 kilowatts of rooftop being installed last year. And they plan to do the same for wind this year. Already 6 gigawatts have been approved and are under construction, and they're planning another 10 gigawatts by 2030. Vietnam also plans to introduce to issue a new power development plan next year. And a recent excerpt showed that the forecast is now 37 gigawatts of coal in 2030, much lower than the previous forecast of 54. And I'll come back to that later. So let's move to the demand side. As Courtney mentioned, there was a big impact on GDP, but I think the impact on electricity consumption was fairly small. Thailand's demand was about 3% lower last year, and Vietnam increased. And the growth in Vietnam is at the moment forecast to be higher than previously estimated. So our alternative plan assumption may be on the low side. And it's also impacted by space cooling, energy conservation, and electric vehicles. What's space cooling? What's space cooling? It's the use of fans, air conditioning, chillers to cool buildings. And there's a huge demand for it. Last year, 20% of the world's electricity consumption were used for space cooling. And it's going to increase, and especially in this region with increasing disposable incomes, warmer weather. Last year, Thailand used about 60 terawatt hours. That's about 30% of total consumption. And this is forecast to double. So consumption on space cooling will double in Thailand by 2030. And the problem, or the culprit, are these single unit window air conditioners, domestic aircon. The efficiency is very low. Better technology is available, could easily reduce the electricity consumption for aircon by 20–30% for a very modest price increase, and a larger percentage is also possible. Needs government regulations to achieve that. My favorite slide in this presentation. EVs are not a 21st century invention. If you look at in 1900, 120 years ago, the USA Motor Show had more electric vehicles on display than petrol cars or steam cars. But 10 years later, they're obsolete. And that's because petrol and diesel cars became more reliable, and the distance that electric vehicles could drive between charges was very limited. So along came Elon Musk and introduced the Tesla sports car in 2008, and hasn't looked back since then. Electric vehicles have two big advantages. The energy efficiency is 80%. Compared to 20% plus for internal combustion engines. And the second big advantage is they don't have any exhaust pipe, no tailpipe. So no CO2 emissions, no NOx emissions, no particulates. But they do have expensive, heavy batteries. The picture I just showed of the Tesla sports car, the battery was over 500 kilos, more than half a ton. But before I move to the next slide, I want to present a few facts relating to electric vehicles. First, if I could wave a magic wand and change all Thailand's 20 million cars instantaneously to electric vehicles, they would use less electricity than air conditioning. That surprised me. Second, those 20 million EVs would reduce carbon dioxide emission by 70 million tons a year, which is an enormous part of Thailand's CO2 emissions. Third fact, Thailand uses about 1 million barrels a day of crude oil. 70% is converted into petrol and diesel. But because of the low efficiency of today's engines, nearly 80% of that transport fuel just generates heat. It heats the outside air, which Thailand doesn't need. I think that's shocking. So EVs would save an enormous amount of crude oil imports for Thailand, and in money terms, about 5% of Thailand's GDP, a huge incentive to speed up the transition to electric vehicles. Next. So how much electricity do EVs use? If you look at the figure for 2030, the current Thailand government target is to have about 1 million EVs on the road. And that will use less than 1% of Thailand's projected demand in 2030. And if you look at 2050, and that figure assumes a 100% switch from conventional engines to EVs, that would result in about 15% of Thailand's electricity used for EVs. Right, so next one. Amazon presented this earlier, and what I want to show you now in the next slide is how the numbers change with putting some of those updates in that I just mentioned. You can see the net present value goes down, $250 to $170 billion, still a very large number. And you can see most of the numbers are zero because they're rounded off, and I've also excluded a few minor items such as transmission loss. The main change in these numbers is the reduction in coal power plants planned for Vietnam. So that reduces the capital investment and the CO2 emission. But still, $170 billion is still a lot of money to save. Last one. So finally, what are the benefits of the alternatives plan? We think the assumptions are still valid, and that the alternative plan, so no coal, no mainstream hydropower, it will reduce investment, less carbon dioxide emissions, and as Apison mentioned earlier, major health benefits. Now, I should end here, but I just want to add one point as I'm talking about updates. And we've Courtney mentioned and Apison mentioned about the reduction of the price of solar. And I just want to mention the price of coal. Just early 2020, just after COVID was found, coal was trading at about $50 to $60 a ton. It's now over $200 a ton. So the variable costs for coal at the moment are much higher than 10 cents, which is, so solar and wind are much more attractive now than coal. And even the long-term coal price just makes coal no longer economically viable, as well as being an environmental disaster. Okay, I'll end here. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Apison, and thank you, Courtney, as well for the second presentation. I think it's time for us to hear from our other experts in this area, our panelists. We are delighted to be joined by the expert in the alternative energy policy in the Mekong regions, and both from the Mekong countries and US. So maybe we start from hearing from Travis Loader. His thought on these two studies that link the Mekong region to the broader global trend based on your experience in strategic energy analysis and the renewable energy technologies and market. So, Travis.
Thank you, Panita. And thank you, Courtney, David, and Epsom for your great presentations and your excellent work on these papers. I want to zero in on something that was thematic between the presentations, which is storage, unaugmented renewables alone won't achieve the kinds of emissions reductions or penetration levels that we're all hoping to see for sustainability reasons and otherwise. Obviously, storage is going to get us the distance, but someone said to me the other day that storage is like the bacon of the energy world. It goes with everything. So it's not just renewables that storage is going to help, but it could be systems, traditional thermal systems, the grid entire, right? Storage brings flexibility to the grid. It can facilitate all kinds of operational efficiencies. And I think another important thing to realize is that the grid of today is not going to get us to the kind of renewables penetration that we'd all like to see either. There are going to need to be some changes both on the regulatory side, the technical side, and storage helps a great deal there as well. So I think that now we heard, I believe it was Courtney's presentation, she indicated that countries are beginning to look at this in a real way. The focus to date has been on increasing renewables, which is good. But on the the second half of the story is going to have to be the penetration of that storage. It doesn't necessarily have to be lithium ion. That's the sort of front runner today. I think also, as Courtney mentioned, electric vehicles have a lot to do with that. The supply chain, technology development have just matured to the point because of the electric vehicle market where we've seen a lot of cost drops and a lot of deployment for those technologies. But it could be other means of storage. Certainly, pumped hydro, it's very old storage technology, still works, still can be a low-cost option depending on water resources. And other battery chemistries, and also mechanical storage. There's, I think we've all heard about this technology that lifts these blocks and then holds them until moments when energy dispatch is required, and then slowly releases the blocks down to generate energy. So lots of technologies out there, lots of opportunity. We're still waiting for those costs to edge a little lower, but the learning curves and the supply chain development and the technology maturity and the cost drops are all happening. People like to invoke the analogy to solar. That storage is where solar was 10 years ago or so. So we're all looking forward to see what that technology can do for the grid. And importantly, what it can do in terms of bringing resilience to communities, not just local communities, but whole energy systems. Disasters are natural disasters and natural threats, COVID being sort of a threat, although maybe not necessarily applicable in terms of how it can impact energy sectors. But we see that insured losses, economic losses from natural disasters and other threats are skyrocketing in recent years, and resiliency, maintaining power sector operations during times of outage has become increasingly important, not only from a reliability standpoint, but also from just a keeping people alive standpoint. Running hospitals and rescue operations at times where natural disasters strike, critical. And storage paired with renewables at a local level, at a system level, can facilitate these things. So I think that storage is, we've been hearing about it for years now, but still one of the most interesting stories in power sector developments and trends, and in this region, definitely. So I think on the broader scale, it'll be interesting to see how the world deploys this technology, but locally appropriate solutions are, something that is important in the storage arena. So seeing how the Mekong region implements this technology and uses it in the political economy of how they've got their energy system structured will be a very interesting development indeed. So those are my 2 cents. Thank you.
Thank you, Travis. Yeah, that's so maybe we move on to next panelist, Ms. Lin Dan from Hanoi University of Science and Technology. You can chime in based on your experience on working with the energy demand supply projection, the low carbon policy research, and the cost benefit analysis.
Hello, Pineda, can you hear me well?
Yes.
Is it a little bit better than the trial session that we did earlier? Okay. First of all, thanks Courtney and Stimson Center for extending the invitation to me to join this very interesting seminar. And the presentation of Courtney already is very comprehensive and informative. Although it covers Mekong region, but many of the information of Vietnam is already available there. So I think I don't need to restate that information, and you can find a lot of interesting data and analysis in Courtney's presentation and paper. So that's why she kindly asked me to share some trends in Vietnam energy developments. And I think it's very good questions because in Vietnam now we are in the middle of a lot of controversial discussion on energy planning. Why I say we are in the middle of the controversial discussion, because the energy picture has changed a lot. As you already seen in the presentation, that during the past 3 years, the share of renewable increased sharply because of our policy of our renewable energy policy, especially the very favorable fit policy for solar, wind, especially solar rooftop as at the latest. So we have to change. And also in 2016, we decided to halt the nuclear power plant. So we had it in our previous planning, but we don't have it anymore. That's why we have to revise our planning. And because of this revision, as well as we are trying to developing our first comprehensive energy master plan. So there are a lot of discussion going on in Vietnam now. So what kind of journey we should carry on, and what kind of pathway we should enter in the next 10 years, 15 years. It's very lively right now. Talking a little bit about the first energy planning, why was it first? Because previously we only care about not only care about, sorry to use that word, maybe it's misleading, but we put more concentration on the power sector. So we have coal planning, oil and gas planning strategy, but we have never had a very comprehensive energy planning. And now we are working on that with with the support of many international organizations. So back to our conversation about the Vietnam energy trend. So of course, you know that Vietnam is a developing country with very high GDP growth rates. Especially in the past 5 years, we are growing at around 6 to 7% per year. And this, even during COVID-19, we as one of the very limited countries can maintain our positive growth. And we are expected to grow around 4.8% this year. And it's a little bit lower than the forecast of a World Bank. Forecast of World Bank and ADB, as far as I remember, is around 6%. So our economy recovered very fast. It's expected to be recovered very fast. So there is one thing I need to say for sure, that the energy demand in the next 10 years will be increasing at a quite high speed. So we have a big challenge, that is to meet the energy demand. Of course, our population keep increasing, although it's not very, very fast, but that's our challenge. So, and the second challenge is that our traditional resources that we used to rely on is now decreasing very fast as well. For example, we have been relying on hydropower. It's been occupying around like 30 to 40% of the generation, but now it already reached it's already like mature, so we can't develop the big hydropower anymore. Coal has a lot of problems that I don't need to really state it here, like although coal is very good for example, base load, but for example, environmental problems, natural resource limitation, scarcity of natural resources, we turn into the coal importer country since 2015, from a very big exporter to an importer. So from that kind of information, you can expect that we no longer be proud of being rich and like wealthy in natural resources, especially coal. So that's hydro, coal, and also oil and gas. Oil and gas, it's very stable. And we haven't seen a very optimistic picture about having a very new, like suddenly big sources of oil and gas in the future. So it's real big pressure for Vietnam. In the years to come, we want to put more renewable energy into our planning. However, as you see in the past 3 years, there are already a lot of problems. We tried, Vietnam is very progressive in in integrating more renewable energy. And at this moment, I think we add already 20 gigawatts to the capacity, installed capacity for renewable energy since the FIT policy. So a lot of issues coming up with that kind of rapid change. For example, the curtailment. Curtailment is already mentioned in your presentation. Has caused a lot of investment deficit for the investor, and also other shortcoming. And there are delays in new projects as well. For example, late COD that cannot meet the FIT deadline, or the slow approval, the administrative procedure, etc. So that kind of shortcomings is really a big hindrance to our development pathway of renewable energy. Not to mention about its variability. What I mean is that wind and solar power is variable energy, so it has its own shortcomings. That's why in the future, there are two trends that we can kind of rely on. The first is like to ensure we have enough power for especially the base load. We need to develop the infrastructure for import LNG. So LNG is expected to gradually, step by step, replace coal, the role of coal in ensuring the base load. And secondly, we need to do more investment in new technology. For example, as mentioned before, battery storage, EV, or microgrid with smart solutions. However, this is quite expensive, so it's not really mentioned. It's not like strongly mentioned in our discussion right now. More than that, I think when we talk about renewable energy, we shouldn't only mention about solar and wind, which is very, very hot right now. Renewable energy also include other type, for example, biomass, or we can like think of waste to energy as a very, very strong and very environmental friendly technology. Vietnam is agricultural based economy, so in terms of feedstock for biomass development, I can be confident that if we if we concentrate on this kind of renewable energy, we can also at the same time increase our share of renewable energy in the future, as well as we can solve many of our, for example, investment issues or of our environmental issues as well. So I think if, because I can't stay after 10, so I think I see one chat, I see one comment in the chat color, saying that if we ever consider about small hydro, I think it's a general questions for everybody, but in terms of like from Vietnam point of view, 1 or 2 years ago, we have to remove a lot of small hydro power plants from the plannings, and also we have to cancel many projects because of its shortcomings. For example, because we are trying to encourage small hydro as a very new and very environmental friendly type of energy. So we forget that it also causes environmental issues to locals as well, and because of some some problems in the, how can I say, it's like planning and approval of projects. So too many projects enter the market, then the project quality is decreasing a lot. So that's the small experience from Vietnam. We did concern about small scale hydropower, but I think we didn't do it in the right way. So we have to experience a very bitter experience with that 1 or 2 years ago. So that's my sharing on this issue.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dan, for the deep dive in the Vietnam situation, and also starting with answer some of the questions in the chat box. So please, the audience, please keep the questions coming in. We will take the last half hour to discuss more openly. But for now, let's go back to our panelists. The next panelist, maybe we can deep dive more focus with both papers have been mentioned that Thailand play the key player of the energy trend driver in this region. So next, let's hear from the co-author of the Thailand's energy scenario studies that Courtney is also one of the co-authors. Phimsupat Gotchang, she's from Energy Research Institute at Chulalongkorn University, Thailand. So let's hear about her opinions on her experience on energy policies and economics and the models that related to transmission of energy systems. Yes, Phimsupat, please.
Thank you so much, Kun Pinida. And thank you, Courtney, Apisom, and David for your presentation. It's very comprehensive and insightful presentations. So I would like to mention, as Courtney mentioned, about the reduction cost of renewable energy, especially for solar energy, which price dropped 90%. And I would like to highlight about the opportunities for the investment on the renewable energies, especially solar energies. And also this is the great opportunity for policymakers to devise plan to support renewable energies as an official target, like solar with the battery technologies. And for example, consider substitute project like the floating solar and a hybrid floating solar, like a floating solar with hydropower. This might be more economically attractive in terms of investment and also price, and also attain more reliable for the year-round productions. As mentioned about the price drop of the solar technologies, this is also the provide the opportunities to diversify power mix in both Thailand, Vietnam, for example. And currently, Thailand by the EGAT, the Electricity Generating Authority of Thailand, they is the first utility that combine the floating solar power with the hydropower for electric generations, and it's already successfully CODs with the 45 megawatt recently, I think in the last August this year. According to Thailand PDP 2018, they also have planned for 2,725 megawatt for domestic floating solar generation by 2037. And also, they also have the 16 hydro floating solar hybrid projects currently, and they are planned to develop and achieve by 2037. I would like to highlight a bit more about the benefit of hybrid floating solar with the hydropower, such as it's a lower cost due to the large generating capacities, and also use the existing power system infrastructures, such as transmission system, transformers, and also use space for maximize benefit. And also integrate with the energy storage system to enhance power system security and make the renewable firms power. And also it's a no impact on the society, community, and environment. In addition, in terms of, I mentioned about the solar in the large scale, like floating solar, I would like to highlight about the small scale solar, like rooftop solar. I would like to recommend like policymakers in Thailand and Vietnam can consider like sharing lessons from integrating rooftop solar technology with the neighboring countries to continue promote local resilience and also recover for the post-pandemic of COVID-19. Like Vietnam, Vietnam has the supporting policy for small scale deployment of rooftop solar. As you can see the number of the total capacity in the David slide. So Vietnam adopt like a feed-in tariff to support grid connected rooftop solar, and also they have the policy to support the PPA for the purchaser and independent generators. And for Thailand, we also have the supporting policy for small scale rooftop solar for the households, but we are a bit lag behind Vietnam in terms of the policy. We quite not attractive much to get more attention from the household sector to adopt solar PV. But I think this is also the opportunity for Thailand to learn from Vietnam as well. So this is all my opinion. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So let's hear more additional from our last panelist, Raphael Schmidt, who's from Stanford University, and based on your experience using the model on managing water, energy, and ecosystem services for the world's vast river and the link to the global water and energy challenge. So you could chime in on how this strategic hydropower planning play a role and link that to the environmental impacts and economic benefits. Please, Raphael.
Yeah, thank you, Penita. Thank you, everybody. I hope you can hear me okay.
Yes.
Great. Okay, so thank you for organizing this very interesting panel, and thank you to the Stimson Center and the donors for spearheading this energy and environmental impact analysis. So first, let me say, I think it's great that the countries of the Mekong region are all ready to embark on this kind of strategic considerations about their energy future, and specifically from which electricity generating technologies they are going to meet their future demand. And I think one key challenge here is really to consider trade-offs, as it has come up that most forms of energy generation will have some sort of impact, right? Like coal will have impact from mining, from the combustion, and impacts on health and air quality. Solar might have impacts through storage and lithium-ion batteries that are relying on rare minerals and so on. And very importantly, and that's kind of my core area of focus, of research focus, is the impacts of hydropower on river systems and on people. And I think there are very few rivers in the world where this can be better demonstrated than in the Mekong. On the one hand, many people in the Mekong region depend on the rivers for their livelihoods. And this can be directly, for example, through fishing or extracting other products from the rivers, but also in a way indirectly. For example, 17 million people live on the Mekong Delta and like farm on the Mekong Delta. And the Mekong Delta is basically just sediment that has been deposited by the Mekong River over the past several thousand years. So as more and more hydropower is going to be built in the Mekong River basin, the Mekong Delta receives less and less sediment, and this reduction in sediment supply will make the delta and also all the livelihoods that the delta support much more vulnerable to climate change, to rising sea levels, to erosion of lands and livelihoods. And through that, these impacts of hydropower are not only going to be local. If Thailand builds a dam on the main stem of the Mekong, yes, it will have impact on like local farmers who get displaced, and on like ecosystems that get displaced. But eventually, through the reduction of sediment transport to the Mekong Delta, the decision to build a dam upstream will also have impacts on downstream livelihoods. And so now the question is, what can we do about it? Like, how can we reduce these trade-offs between energy development, energy access, and the systemic impacts of hydropower? And the approach that I believe very firmly is probably most effective is through strategic planning. So basically the idea here is to look at the impacts and benefits the different combinations of dams have on the river system and on associated ecosystem services, natural values, and livelihoods. So for example, in the study that we did with the Stimson Center, or that was led by the Stimson Center by Courtney specifically, we looked at the impact that Thailand's energy decisions have on the Mekong River basin. So for example, Thailand could invest into main stem hydropower dams, large dams on the main river, or into multiple smaller tributary dams. And I think one of the key take-home messages that we found there is that investments in these like smaller projects can result in nearly the same amount of energy available for Thailand, with much smaller impact on the Mekong River, and yeah, just mentioned the associated livelihoods. And another point that I'd like to make is that it's really like the kind of like urgent time now to make this kind of like strategic decisions. Right now, there are already like 50 to 60 major dams existing on the Mekong River, impacting sediment transport, impacting fish migration, and so on. And I think really just adding a few more of those big main stem dams with like big impacts could really push the system kind of like across a border where we see like a major impact or even bigger impact on fisheries and even bigger impact on sediment transport and downstream livelihoods. And I think it's really high time to embark on this strategic planning. And just probably a few words before we move to the discussion about what I think is kind of like still hindering it, or still hindering more strategic planning in the Mekong region. I think first is a willingness of all the countries to coordinate and basically to be willing to buy power from the least impact hydropower projects if they really need hydropower for their energy mix. Embark on a strategic basin scale process to select which projects they are. And in order to do so, there is still a need to get better information about where does most of the fish migration happen in the Mekong? Where does most of the sediment come from in the Mekong and so on? So I think there's still like a big need to study how the Mekong River as an entire integrated socio-ecologic system will be impacted by different energy strategies. However, I think it's very promising that the countries are now increasingly considering the high environmental impacts of hydropower. And I think these kind of like studies that the Stimson Center is preparing are a very important first step to show that there are energy futures, energy alternatives that are both low carbon, meet socioeconomic needs, but don't sacrifice ecosystems related to rivers in the Mekong region. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Raphael. I think now it's time for the open questions that we have a few already in the Q&A box. And I think it's time to ask our presenters, Courtney, Abisom, and David, to continue discussing on the first questions that Dan and Pim Supa already started. on the idea of the smaller scales or utilizing what the existing water infrastructure that we already have in each country. So Courtney, Absom, and David, which one of you would like to go first, or just one of you would be fine to sharing on the smaller scale issue?
Well, I can jump in and start just briefly. So, I think there's, when we talk about small scale hydropower, there's two separate conversations that are taking place. One is about building new structures that could be used to produce electricity, and the other is looking at ways to retrofit existing infrastructure. And I think that was what the question was focused on. So I have not seen a broad strategic discussion around the region about the amount of power that's available from retrofitting existing infrastructure. And I think part of the potential challenge with this, although it might make sense in terms of strategically avoiding impacts and strategically avoiding the need for future capital investments, is that power planners have historically looked at large scale power planning investments as sort of the type of investments that require necessary public funds in terms of support from the state, or in terms of large negotiations for power purchase agreements. And I think we're starting to see some of the shift away from that in countries that have adopted a lot of rooftop solar. Vietnam, for instance, we talked about the amount of rooftop solar that was added. That was across more than 100,000 rooftop solar installation systems. So you do have countries that have to become increasingly familiar with sort of managing inputs from a lot of small projects. We also did hear as well from Don about some of the challenges that Vietnam ran into in terms of managing many of those small projects, in terms of, licensing, in terms of permitting, in terms of tracking exactly which projects are going up. And then I think finally, in terms of water impacts, because while the impacts of small hydropower projects are significantly less in terms of overall storage capacity compared to traditional hydropower projects, they do still have some impact on sort of the local water availability, the local flow of water that can impact the local environment. And sometimes, particularly when drought is becoming more common, if you're looking at infrastructure that doesn't have storage built in, it's going to face many of the same challenges that we've seen facing larger hydropower projects in recent years, when there simply is not water available. So you can't necessarily count on hydropower to be a reliable source of electricity in times of drought. So I'll just sort of throw that out as an answer. It's not as specific as I'd like, and I see David has unmuted himself, so I'll turn to David, since I think.
No, I will let Apisam answer this one.
Well, then I suppose I'll turn to Apisam and let him share some thoughts, perhaps, on what's happening with this in Thailand.
So we have seen the integration of the small weir and dike with the solar cell in terms of pumping water. This is already happened in Thailand. And for the second questions about the gas and the base load, I think our assumption in the alternative plan, we still using gas as a bridge fuel. So we didn't totally eliminating gas from the model, but we just replacing renewable with the coal. So, and some of the questions about the incentives on efficiency and peak demand, David already talked about, upgrading the aircon standard, improving building code, pricing system. That is also something that we should look at in terms of like Thailand. Like, for example, we can price and give incentives for the people who charge their electric car at night time when we don't need much electricity or something like that. Okay, I will let the rest to David to answer.
No, nothing more to add.
Okay. Anyone? Okay, I see. Raphael, you want to add in?
I just had few thoughts on that, actually. I think first we have to make a distinction when we talk about these small hydropower plants, talking either about rural electrification of remote communities that could hardly be served otherwise, or talking about the contribution of these small hydropower projects to the bigger grids. It seems to me that in terms of contribution to the bigger grids, these retrofits are probably not going to make a huge difference. However, I think for like specific kind of like smaller communities, they can be like a very important contribution to like energy security. You know, like the second distinction is really, I think, when we talk about small hydropower, about like retrofitting existing structures that doesn't have a lot of additional impacts. But of course, we also have to think that many of these, for example, irrigation dams in Thailand are already quite old, so they might require some structural work to be actually like fit for being retrofitted, and this might be costly. And then there are these kind of like greenfield projects, and I think one big challenge with those that we've seen in Europe and the United States and many places is that often the environmental oversight for these small projects is much smaller. And even though the individual project has not so much impact on the rivers, if you build many of these small projects, you can still have a major impact. So I think like the role of small hydro really depends on what we're looking at. I think another interesting topic, if we talk about retrofitting, is probably with regard to pump storage, because I think there are very few pump storage plants in the Mekong region, but lots of existing reservoirs that might be potentially retrofitted and play a role as an energy buffer in the system in the future. So I think retrofits can still be an important issue in the energy debate in the Mekong.
Thank you, Rafael. I think Phil has already mentioned the discussion on starting on the efficiency side, and we have, I think, one or two questions regarding the efficiencies. The first one is, can we talk more about efficiencies of the great industry, commercial, household, and reducing the waste use? And also another one, I think, is related that about the incentives to install more efficiency technology in the larger buildings, industry, and also housing appliance. Anyone want to start?
David, did you want to chime in? I know you've done
Well, I can comment on the amount of electricity used for cooling buildings. If you remember in my presentation, I said at the moment 20% of the world's electricity is used, and I think the forecast globally is 40% in 20 years. And the problem in Thailand and Vietnam is electricity conservation, energy conservation doesn't get much attention. If I look at the number of emails I get on solar and wind and battery storage, it's about 10 times more than on energy conservation. And the energy conservation here is buildings do not have insulation on the walls or on the roofs or have double glazing. And that would save 20 to 30% of electricity. And if we had more efficient aircon units, I said, that could have a big impact on the demand and therefore on future generation capacity. So we need to spend more attention here on energy conservation. Note to the Minister of Energy.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just sort of second what David said. I think when you look sort of at regional energy planning, there's a challenge in terms of energy efficiency, and it has, I think, something to do with the fact of who is investing in which of these things. You know, when you're looking at energy efficiency investments, whether it's improvements to housing or improvements to buildings or improvements to the appliances that are being used to upgrade them, those tend to be investments that have to be done unless there's some sort of subsidy or tax assistance or other benefit provided by the government. Those investments have to be done by the building owners or by the household managers. Or, you know, if you're looking at an apartment building, the apartment building owner has to decide that they want to invest in all of these efficiency improvements or efficient technologies. So when you're thinking about sort of the user, there has to be sort of a clear cost benefit analysis that will incentivize individual users to invest in some of these technologies if we're talking about many of these sort of household level things. I think there are, you know, other opportunities within the grid to improve efficiency somewhat. I mean, when you think about sort of the transmission line infrastructure in many of the countries, there's a lot of losses over transmission lines, particularly long distance transmission lines. There may be some improvements by upgrading the lines, particularly in countries in the Mekong that have older or outdated electricity systems. Countries are facing sort of that crunch, of course, of expanding the grid in general because there's more electricity being used and then replacing and upgrading older lines, but there are certainly opportunities there. I think broadly as well, there's potentially some opportunities to avoid losses through the transmission lines by utilizing more locally produced electricity. So that's one of the big benefits of distributed solar, or solar in general, is that it's modular, and it can, in Southeast Asia at least, can be efficiently deployed almost anywhere on site. So you're not facing some of those long distance transmission losses that you would see more broadly.
I agree completely with you, Courtney. Yeah, I agree. Just on air conditioning, I said in my presentation, I think it needs government intervention. Now, governments are not going to stop people buying aircon because they want to stay cool. But what governments can do is they can increase the standards. I did a review of efficiency of aircon units in Thailand compared to the rest of the world, and it's very low because obviously people here will not do a cost benefit analysis. They will just go and buy what looks nice and is the cheapest. So I think we need some government regulations on building codes and aircon efficiency.
Thank you both. We still have several questions coming, and our panelists will be typing in out some answers. Still, if anyone wants to ask live questions, feel free to raise your hand, or if you have any opinions to share, please do raise your hand or type in the chat box. We can go to the next one on. I think we cover the questions about the best moving to renewable energy already. And anyone want to maybe add on what role should natural gas play? If you have additional from your presentation.
I'll just briefly chime in and say, I think there's a debate that I think can happen about what role should natural gas play, and I think a lot of that's going to depend on the country's situations where they are now and where they are looking to go. For instance, I know historically Thailand has over-relied in many ways on natural gas, and so in Thailand there's a long-running push to sort of diversify and move away from natural gas, which right now means I think renewables are the big opportunity. For countries like Vietnam or Cambodia, which have historically underinvested in natural gas and perhaps are overinvested in coal, natural gas has the opportunity potentially to play a role as a bridge fuel towards renewables. And that's the way that a lot of policymakers are sort of framing the conversation about natural gas, as a way to sort of support phasing out coal while still providing sufficient baseload. So it's not really an answer about what should be happening, because I think that's a question that needs to be answered at the individual country level. But that's a quick overview of the way that I think the conversation about natural gas is playing out in the Mekong region right now.
Just to add to what Courtney said, if you work as a grid manager, natural gas is great because it has a very quick response time, and if electricity demand changes quickly, gas is great to respond to that. But as I mentioned earlier, the price of coal has quadrupled in the last 2 years, and the price of gas is also going up. And Thailand imports gas, building LNG stations. So I think the problem, gas has great technical benefits, but the price is going to become more expensive, which makes renewables more economically attractive.
Okay, thank you both. I think we touched upon the issue about how to drive the policy changes for more alternative energies, and we also have questions on that, how much effort are being made to address the alternative to the political decision makers. The policy formulation side. Okay, Courtney, I see you.
Yeah, so I'm happy to sort of jump in on the policy question. I mean, I think you're absolutely right. It does really depend on political will. And I think with renewable energy technologies, at this point in time, the arguments that used to be raised against it, for instance, that renewable energy is too expensive, are largely starting to fade away. It's very clear right now that there is an economic case to be made for the integration of renewable energy. I think the big challenge is to look at the ways that individual countries' planning departments are sort of supporting the renewable energy transition in terms of, what's the timing? What are their targets? Are they updating their targets regularly to keep track with what's happening in the marketplace, which often outpaces policymakers when there's an economic incentive for transition? And more broadly, I think it's important to sort of think about ways to be strategic, because one of the big challenges for the Mekong region, as Raphael in particular highlighted, is the dependence and the importance of the Mekong River in maintaining sort of the natural flow and the natural environmental and food, water, and energy security provisions that come with that natural flow from the Mekong River. And we are sort of in a situation where without strategic engagement, it's very possible for the renewable energy transition to successfully play out in the region, where many countries do start moving towards renewable energy alternatives. And yet there are still some specifically located, very impactful hydropower projects that move forward. So I think within that context, it's particularly important to have studies like not just sort of the policy analysis that was presented on today's panel from Apisal Manoa and from myself about sort of what are the trends and finding ways to get that information into the hands of policymakers so that they can see what's coming. I think there are a lot of people and a lot of actors that are doing that, but also to have some of those broader strategic conversations about ways that the information from those studies and the information collected by national governments can be put to use in sort of a strategic, broad big picture thinking sort of approach. And studies like the forthcoming study that Raphael mentioned, that was sort of a complementary study to these two presented here today, that looks at specific alternative planning portfolios and models out what some of those impacts are, I think can be particularly useful for policymakers who are faced with needing to consider trade-offs across many different potential trends, and having sort of further conversations about those alternative scenarios, or thinking sort of not just in terms of this is the plan and we're pursuing it, but how can we make the plan to be more comprehensive in a way that allows flexibility 5 years down the road when the energy market is a very different beast than it is today, is a particularly important provision of technical assistance and a particularly important engagement opportunity for policymakers.
Thank you, Courtney. I think it would be more be interesting to maybe deep dive a little bit for Thailand case and Vietnam case, if Pim Supa and Dan can chime in on this, driver to issue this the change of the alternative energy development policy that we can see that for this region. Thailand, Vietnam has been very active on this. Pim Supa or Dan, would you be able to add in your thoughts about this?
Yes. For Thailand, I think Thailand have a clear target for renewable energies. Like for example, solar, even the biomass, biogas, or even the floating solar projects. And one thing that I see is in terms of the missing policy, which is the tools or supporting mechanism to reach that target. Like for example, solar energy target in Thailand, like especially for households adoptions. First, they set quite the big number, like 10,000 megawatt for household alone. And after that, they increased the numbers of the target because of the, in terms of implementations of the policies, is not much in terms of like much actions or facilitate for people to, for example, like to finish the project, like, I mean, in terms of the permitting process or the interconnection for the solar PV into the grid. So I would like to say that in terms of the policies directions, the government should provide clear and also provide the tools that can be implemented in the real situation. I mean, to reach the target that they set. And currently, Thailand already launched the National Energy Policies or NEP, which is aimed to increase the use of renewable energy like 50%. And also they also include the EV plan in the National Energy Plan. And so this is quite the first starting for the Thailand to achieve the carbon reduction target also. Yes, this is my opinion.
Thank you, Khun Supa, and apologize that Dan is in another call, so she cannot answer live. So I think we are about 10:15 already. I think let's do a little just one questions and see that it could be a good wrap up that since we mentioned about the investment and policy and how. We have another questions on how the the finance sources, foreign financiers played a role in that, and how this financial access challenges the prospect of the sustainable energy development in this region. So, would like Courtney, please.
Yeah, I'm happy to start, and then whoever else wants to chime in on this is certainly welcome, because I think it's a complex topic that's worth more discussion than we'll be able to give it on the call tonight as we wrap up. But I think the big challenge with energy financing in the Mekong region is not so much that there's not investment available, because there's a number of outside investors, whether that's Thailand investing in its neighboring countries, whether that's financing coming from China, whether that's international development banks, private sector from Japan. There's a wide range of stakeholders investing in energy generation broadly. The challenge is that a lot of this investment has historically been targeted towards the familiar and relatively, or at least perceived as relatively unrisky technologies of coal, natural gas, and large-scale hydropower. So I think when we're looking at sort of the energy transition, the big challenge is ensuring that investment is also directed towards the newer renewable energy projects. And I think that has, getting supportive financing with good financial terms for renewable energy projects has historically been a challenge for the Mekong, and I do think that's starting to change. We've seen over, really the last 5 years, sort of this rapid scale up of commercial solar in particular, and I think that's benefiting from a number of things. One of them is the price drop that we talked about before, but some of that is also just a change in the perception of risk. Many of these technologies, which 5 years ago were unable to get good loan terms and maybe didn't have the best regulatory environment that de-risked these projects in a way similar to hydropower or fossil fuel projects were, the technology's been proven. Policymakers are much more familiar with the technology now. They're familiar with how to integrate it. The loan terms have improved in many cases because the projects are not viewed as a risky investment to the same degree that they were 5 years ago. So I think that the financial opportunities have expanded for renewable energy technologies. I think the big challenge moving forward will be to ensure that all of these sort of surrounding regulatory environments and other questions of what makes a project bankable continue to receive attention. Because particularly when you're looking at sort of competitiveness, there's often going to be financing for these older technologies that are familiar and which have a lot of momentum behind them from key players in the sector. But moving into sort of the new alternative renewables, sometimes this requires policy changes. Sometimes this requires changing the terms of power purchase agreements. So there's a lot of sort of regulatory and policy changes that may need to continue to evolve over the next 5 to 10 years as new technologies with battery storage come in order to sort of make those projects bankable and competitive with the traditional projects that they're competing with when you're looking at sort of an open energy market. And I think there's a lot of work that can be done learning from successful case studies such as Vietnam's experience with deploying rooftop solar, or some of the auction systems that we're seeing in other places around the Mekong region, like Myanmar or even Malaysia, or Cambodia, competitive procurement that has really sort of helped show that these projects are bankable and have multiple people bidding on them and have sort of led a path to identify what makes those successful procurements.
Thank you so much, Courtney. I think that's wrap up our discussion today. I'd like to thank you so much, the presenters and our panelists who made time for us, and especially other participants who tuned in to this to join us today. So, Courtney, do you have any last announcement?
No particular announcements. I'll just echo Panita's thanks to everyone who joined us and stuck with us for today's conversation. I know I always learn a lot when we get so many experts on the call together, and hopefully all of you have too. I will just note, the recording of this will be available online soon, and we also do have access to the questions that we weren't able to answer on the call tonight. So I'll happily share those with the rest of the panelists, and those of you who asked specific questions and didn't get an answer might receive a personal email from someone who's interested in providing an answer on that point. So thank you all for joining us today. Stimson Center is so delighted to have hosted this conversation, and we look forward to continuing this conversation in future discussions about Mekong power developments.
Thank you all. Stay safe, stay